I'm going to go over here to the workshop and hook up all of the solar. And while I'm doing that, I will explain how all of this works. So here we are in the workshop. So we're going to take these two batteries. Right now they're in parallel. I've been top balancing them. And I've got a little 12 volt inverter. And I got a variety of fuses and wires and razzmatazz. And I'm going to hook it all up today. And I'll show you how it all works together. Okay, so the first thing I did was I built a shelf. Well, I guess actually the first thing I did was cleaned up the area a little bit, but then the second thing I did was I built a shelf, and this is just a quick shelf to hold the batteries out of recycled wood. And as everybody probably knows, wood is really expensive, so I try to reuse as much as I possibly can. So now that I have a home for the batteries, I put the batteries over here, and they are in parallel, which means I have two 12 volt batteries, and I'm going to have a 12 volt system. So I'm going to double my amperage, but I'm going to keep the voltage the same. Now if I had put them in series, it'd be the exact opposite. I would double the voltage, but I would keep the amperage. So that's step one. Now let's get everything else together. So my solar setup here is going to require two pieces of equipment I'm going to talk about. One is a solar charge controller, and the other is an inverter. So what the charge controller does is it takes the juice from the solar panels and makes sure that the batteries get charged properly. What this guy does, this inverter, is it takes the 12 volt stuff coming from the battery and it converts it to standard household current, like 110. And then from there you can plug anything you want into it. And it's important when you size all this to get the right size stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be running a small light and an air conditioning unit here. And I ran the numbers already, and it's going to be about 500 watts roughly. And so I have a 1200 watt inverter. So you always want to do more than what you need. So like for example, I need 500 watts. If I got a 600 watt inverter, I'd be pushing that inverter, and it wouldn't work right. You know, the numbers that they say are never really what you can get out of them. So I like to double the size. So I have a 1200 watt inverter, and I'll probably be using 40% of it. That'll probably help it last longer as well. And then the charge controller is the same charge controller I have for my main setup. It's 40 amps, which is much bigger than what I need, but I thought I'd get this one. That way I have a backup if my other charge controller ever goes down. And this is an MPPT charge controller. Those tend to be a little bit nicer, more efficient. So those are the three components. What we're going to do now is we're going to hook up wire. I'm going to use 2 gauge wire for everything. To lower the voltage, for example, my 12 volt system, you need bigger wire. So if I had a 24 volt system or a 48 volt system, I wouldn't need as big a wire. But I like to use 2 gauge wire everywhere, just in case. And I'm not going to be pushing much juice out of this, so the 2 gauge on a 12 volt system will be plenty. So we're going to hook up the wires, and we're going to hook up some fuses and some circuit breakers, and then we'll be ready to rock and roll. Of course, I have a solar panel on the roof that I've already installed, and so that will come down with using 8 gauge wire. And again, 8 gauge wire is more than enough for what I'm doing, but 8 gauge wire is all I use. So I like to oversize all the wires. It's much better to have a wire that's a gauge too big than a gauge too small. If the gauge is too small, you can create a lot of problems, including starting a fire. So the charge controller is now mounted. And when I mount these guys, what I like to do is add a little nut behind it to give it a little extra breathing room so airflow can go underneath it. And this guy's got a nice heat sink, and I'm not going to be pushing it very hard, but you definitely want to make sure you have proper ventilation on these guys so they can dissipate all the heat. So now let's talk about the other components. So I got a fuse, 2 circuit breakers, a monitor, and a bus bar. So where I put the fuse, I put the fuse between the battery and the other components. And there's a way to size it. Sizing is important, so there's a website that I can link to that will show you what size to get depending on the size of your system. And then the two circuit breakers I put between the charge controller and everything else. So juice coming in has got a circuit breaker, and juice going out has a circuit breaker. And those are for protection, and also I can easily turn the system on and off. So the battery monitor is just that. It monitors all the power coming in and out. And then finally that bus bar is where all the negatives are going to go to. So let's hook all this thing up now. So while we're talking about wiring stuff up, we're going to talk about how you actually do that. So you're going to need wire, of course, but these bigger gauge wires, they're hard to strip and to do anything with. So, if you use your normal wire strippers, and I use these on a, like 12-2 wire when I'm running just normal household electrical, they work great on that, and they even have a crimping end on them that works great if you need to crimp smaller things. But when you start getting into these big wires, these 8 gauge, 4 gauge, 2 gauge wires, they just don't work. So that's when you need bigger tools. This guy is great for stripping wire. It'll strip almost anything. I've stripped 2 gauge wire with this, no problem. And then you need to put an end on them, and to do that you need to crimp it. And so you need a nice crimper, and this one is a really good crimper. And if you need an even bigger crimper, then you can use this guy. And what you do with here is you just set the wire in there, and you set it on there, and you crack it with a hammer, and it sets it nicely. There's also hydraulic ones you can get for, I don't know, $80, $100. I'm not that fancy, so I don't have one of those. But you're going to need to do all that, because these guys have got to be mounted, with a real end, and they have to be mounted securely. And then you need to, of course, use the heat wrap, shrink wrap stuff, so you have a really secure connection, because you don't want this stuff shorting out. You don't want it getting loose. That can cause all types of problems. So you want these to be tight and safe. So they're kind of a 101 on crimping and cutting wires. So here we go. Everything is hooked up. You can see, if I zoom in, you can see that my solar panels are producing some juice, and you can see we got some juice going out, and there's the back of the inverter, you can see. And I actually just have a little light on, because the only other thing I have in here is the air conditioner. It's right above here, and if I turn it on, you won't be able to hear me. So this is pretty much how you wire stuff up, and I'll walk you through it in a second. I'm going to start with the temporary thing. This battery meter, this is not how I would set it up permanently. This is just a new one, and I'm just playing with it. I've used a different one in the past, and I wanted to try this one out. And I have it hooked up to the load right now, so you can see it's just measuring what's going on in the load. But it's a pretty powerful meter, so I'm going to play with that a little bit more. But let's walk through everything. So you got the wires coming in. This comes in from the solar panels, and there's my circuit. I can turn that off if I want to turn it off, and then it comes in. And when you're hooking up these wires, you want to pull on them, make sure they're snug. You just use a small screwdriver and you unscrew it, you stick the wire in, it goes in all the way, and then you screw it in. It's pretty easy to do. So on the other side we have the power coming out. So this goes out from the solar controller and eventually goes to the battery, and there's a circuit breaker that I can flip to turn on the entire system or turn off the system. It also, of course, is protection. From there it goes to a fuse, and on the same side of that fuse it goes down to the inverter. So there's a fuse between the battery, the inverter, and the charge controller. Then on the other side of that fuse, of course, goes to the positive of the battery. And then on the other side, we'll start from the battery, we have battery negative, and that goes up to this bus bar. And then the other negative, of course, goes to the charge controller, and then the third negative goes back to the charge controller. So it's a pretty simple setup. This is the minimum that you want to do as far as protection, with the fuse, the circuit breaker, and then this circuit breaker. You want to make sure you use really heavy wire. And again, I'm only pushing out, I'll probably only ever push out 500 or 600 watts. So I mean, I really overwired this thing. You know, the inverter itself is only a 1200 watt inverter, and my load will never be more than 500 or 600 watts. So nice heavy duty wire. And then this guy, I'm going to play with him for a little bit and see what he does in different spots. I have a different meter that I've used before that I really like. So this one looks like it's got a little more, some more features. So this should be exciting. So that's pretty much the setup. That's the setup. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Anybody can do it. And if anybody has any questions about anything, please leave them in the comments. And thanks for watching, and I will talk to you guys soon.